Good morning, gentlemen. Great to see you guys. Can I get you to open your Bible to two places? Romans chapter 12, obviously, our theme verses, and you kind of want to mark that, I think, for the rest of the morning. And then I'd also like to take you to the book of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, which I'd like to use to illustrate what we're talking about this morning. You know, Paul had never been to Rome. He wanted to get there, and I guess eventually he did, didn't he, in chains? But that wasn't really his plan. When he was in Corinth teaching, a sister named Phoebe was traveling to Rome. Paul wrote a letter of introduction for her that turned out to be the book of Romans, quite an introduction. It turned out to be the most theological, I think, work that Paul really wrote. But Romans is an important book. St. Augustine got saved reading Romans. Martin Luther got saved reading Romans. John Bunyan got saved reading Romans. Maybe you got saved reading Romans. It is a different work from Paul because Paul wrote to a church that he had never met, really introduced himself, and was taken by the Spirit to write this very theological book. Paul's typical method of writing is always the same. He wants to convince you of what God has done for you before he then asks you to respond. It really is the fulfillment of we love him because he first loved us. So wherever you go in the scriptures, you find that Paul spends an inordinate amount of time in most books saying, sit back, here's what the Lord's done for you. And then at some point stops and goes, so what are you going to do with that? How are you going to respond? And really, it isn't a blind faith or a faith that is, based upon pressure. It's just a faith based upon what God has done to you. It's a response of love. So if you read the book of Romans for 11 chapters, Paul defines what God has done for us. He starts in chapter 1 talking about the responsibility of sin, that whether it's the pervert or the temple goer or the religious devotee, they're all sinners. They all need salvation. Paul goes through the whole thing about, the justification that comes by faith, the sanctification that God brings. Spends a couple chapters talking about God's sovereignty in choosing you and your responsibility to respond to him. And then you get to this verse in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, and the application begins. Therefore, brethren, I beseech you by the tender mercies of God that you present your body a living sacrifice that is holy and acceptable to the Lord. But it follows 11 chapters of look what God has done for you. You find the same truth in the book of Ephesians. Paul sits down and he begins to write. In fact, the big outline that Watchman needed years ago for the book of Ephesians was sit, walk, and stand. For 3 chapters, just sit down and read about what God has done for you. See yourself as God sees you. And then in chapter 4, therefore, brethren, walk worthy of the calling that you've been called. By the time you get to chapter 6, and stand in his strength and in his might. You find it the same way to be in Colossians. First 2 chapters, all doctrinal in the sense that here's what God has done for you. Now here's what the Lord would like to have you do in response. So everything that you read, especially at the end of 14 of these epistles that Paul wrote, is usually a result of understanding what God has done for you. So how important is it that I learn my word, right? His word for me. That I can respond with love. I can respond out of a gratitude, a thanksgiving, a devotion, and that certainly is the case in Hebrews. Now, because I was given verse 1, I didn't want to trample on verse 2, so I'm taking you to Hebrews chapter 12 to illustrate verse 1. Present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to the Lord. Your reasonable service. When Paul wrote to the Hebrews, unlike the Romans who he had never met, he had met and certainly knew of these Hebrews who were suffering under great persecution. The Lord hadn't come back. There was at least a thought flowing through the church that maybe going back to the old Judaistic ways of life might save you a little trouble. And so Paul does what he always does. He presents what God has done. And for 10 chapters, Paul goes through all of the familiar ground of the Old Testament, speaking to Jewish believers about what they once had. the priesthood, the sacrifices, the feast days, the tabernacle, all of those things that was life to them, or so they believed. And then he said to them, now this is, Jesus is the fulfillment of that. And he's the fulfillment of this. And he's the fulfillment of that. You have a much better life now than you could have ever hoped to have. In fact, by the time he gets to chapter 10, I think it's verse 22 or 23, 24, let us draw near with full assurance, with a heart that is assured in faith, our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our faith without wavering. He's faithful, that's promised. And he ends with, in chapter 10, the just shall live by faith. Ultimately, when you've learned everything that you can about the Lord, you still have to live by faith. It is that motivation, and Paul presents his case. He does it to the Romans, to the Ephesians, to the Colossians, to the Hebrews, but always that same issue. Can I get you to walk with God if you know what God's done for you? And that's really the call. It isn't this end of the whip, straighten up, buddy. It's this, look what God has done. Look how open his arms are. Look how much he's provided. I love him. Not because I have to. I want to, for all that he has done for me. From great delay, in chapter 11, Paul then writes down the examples for 40 verses of heroes of the faith. Those who had come and gone, who had a relationship with the Lord. Some had done well living, some had done well dying, but they were famous stories of faith. They were martyrs and heroes of the Jewish faith. And so for 40 verses, Paul lays out for them examples of those who had run the race and finished the course. In other words, these guys had gone before, and they hadn't quit, turned away, they had finished. Paul will say to the Romans, here's all I've done for you, present your body a living sacrifice. That's reasonable now. He will say to the Hebrews, these guys ran and they didn't quit, now don't you quit. In fact, Paul uses an illustration that he loves, running the race. It's one of his favorites. He wrote of running to win to the Corinthians. He wrote of running well to the Galatians. He wrote of running in vain to the Philippians. Just run. So he calls them here in Hebrews chapter 12, and I hope that you found it now, to run. In fact, let's read verse 1. Therefore, again, there's that therefore, because all that God's done, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. As a young pastor in my 20s, a long time ago, Pastor Chuck asked me to come up to the mountains and teach a men's conference. But I was in my second year of ministry, and Chuck was my hero. I went every study he taught for years. So the thought of me standing up and teaching with Pastor Chuck always sitting where you sit was frightening. I said yes because how could you say no? But I dreaded every day. My stomach hurt, my head hurt. It was not a pleasant 6 weeks leading up to this conference. I did my best, but I felt, even drive up to the mountains, this was not nearly good enough. And I got there and I said, where's Pastor Chuck? And they said, oh, he's home sick this weekend. And I went, thank you, Lord. A few years later, we had an officer in our fellowship who's one of his deputies had been murdered in Manhattan Beach, and they asked me to do the funeral. And it turned out to be in the largest Catholic church there in Manhattan Beach. The fellow that was the priest there was my principal at the Catholic school that I graduated from. But there were 5,000 officers there. The mayor of LA came, the governor of the state came. They closed the freeway as we made our procession to Inglewood Cemetery, and I thought, oh, what am I doing here? A little punk, I don't belong here. And again, I said to myself, I wish I'd have done better. I was very self-conscious. I struggled within. God bless, he always has. But man, you have to learn to rest in the Lord, don't you? So imagine maybe you're a golfer and one of these good golfers invites you to go play, I think you'd hate it. Oh, you'd like it, but you'd hate it. Everything you do would now be under scrutiny. Well, Paul kind of takes that picture in chapter 11 and says, it's your turn to run now. If you look up in the seats, there's a coliseum filled with spectators who have ran this fabled marathon race. And Paul includes himself. Notice he says in verse 1, we also. In the stands, gold medal winners from the past. This isn't a live event in the sense that, from heaven he's saying people are now watching us as we're struggling to get by, but rather this is a call to live the kind of life that would bring witness. He will say in verse 4 of chapter 11 of Abel, he speaks even though he's dead. In other words, he left a legacy, if you will, behind. So in the stands, there was Moses. He knew how to run. So did those who came into Jericho, those who quenched the power of fire, those who were sawn in half, those who were mocked, those who were scourged. Each one of them had run their race and finished it. And now Paul gets to chapter 12, like he always does. Here's what God has done for you. And he says, okay, on your mark, get set, go. And he gives to us, or to them, to all of us, the challenge to live up to the legacy that we join now as God's people. Because this is your generation to reach. This is our generation to reach. As Jacob sits in the stand smiling and Gideon waves the flag, maybe your heart's pounding, you're afraid, you want to do well. The gun goes up, you burst out of the blocks, and then Paul says, get going. Therefore, because we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, therefore, present your body a living sacrifice. It's reasonable. But notice what he says here in verse 1. Lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily besets you. Here, I'll give you 4 words to remember, and it'll be the best way, I think, to leave the message with you. The first word is divest. The word divest, if you're an investor, means to get rid of something that's not making you any money, or to set aside those things that logically aren't benefiting you. So Paul starts by saying to this group that is now running their race under the pressure that they were facing, I want you to lay aside every weight. That makes sense, doesn't it? Nobody runs a marathon in combat boots unless you're in the service. And so the best you can do on the day of running is to get rid of whatever weighs you down. The least amount of weight, the lightest shoes, the smallest clothing. I don't know if you're a runner, but I sometimes see runners who are embarrassing the way they're dressed. Put something on, man. But I think they just want to go fast. I don't know. Paul places these hindrances in 2 categories. Notice in verse 1 here. It is the sin that it is the weight and the sin which so easily besets you. I think one is fairly obvious. Sin it will slow you down. But the other one maybe not so much. This weight, lay aside every weight. Because look, not every hindrance is sin. Or I should say, put it this way. Not every hindrance is sin in itself. Sometimes it is those things that get into your life that in and of themselves are fine, but now it has begun to have a profound influence upon your life. And it is not a beneficial one. It is slowing you down. I think this is the area that many Christians stumble and are slowed down by. It's not the besetting sin, it's the hindrances. I'll give you a personal example. I love hockey. I grew up in Detroit as a young kid, watching the Red Wings play. When we moved here many years ago with my parents, we got Ducks season tickets for years. And we went to the Stanley Cup. I just love hockey. But because the Kings and the Ducks are in town, the Kings get Thursday and Saturday nights for their games, for the most part at home. The Ducks gets Wednesday night and Sundays, which just happens to be church days, thank you very much, for me. So we ended up giving away and selling away lots of tickets because we just can't go. As much as I like hockey, I love church more. But it can become a hindrance. Like when the Stanley Cup came, one of the games was on Wednesday night. And I thought, well, I know the assistant pastors love to teach when I'm in my head I was making a deal with myself before the Lord. And I thought, what do you love more? And I said, I love Jesus more. I love teaching. I love the body. I got to make a choice here. And we stayed in church. But it's that hindrance thing that can get in the way. We have families in our church, sometimes maybe you do as well, who love their children so much that they decide missing church for 6 months for baseball is a good idea, or soccer, or whatever it might be. And month after month, well, they got the games, and there's 3 on Sundays and 2 Wednesday night, and we got to get the kids. But it's the same families that show up 15 years later and wonder what happened to their kids. My kids doesn't want to go to church. Well, what a surprise. It becomes a hindrance. Hindrances weigh you down. They divert your attention. They sap your strength. They take away from you that which the Lord would want to give you to do well, to present your body a living sacrifice, to run the race well. Sometimes it's a relationship. Sometimes it's entertainment. Sometimes it's a sport or an activity or a place or a person or a habit or a pleasure or an honor. Whatever it is, this is something in my life that takes me away from what God would have me to do. I've slowed down. I slow down for a minute. I slow down for a day. I slow down for an hour, but I'm slowing down. I'm not running to win. I'm hampered. I got that hindrance again. I always pick on our guys on Super Bowl Sunday. Some of them, they don't go to church. So I read them this verse. And then I just pretend I never read it. If you're going to run to win and not just finish, Paul's first bit of advice and our response to the Lord's love is get rid of the things which slow you down. Not sin, but for you it's become a hindrance. Secondly, it is the sin that so easily besets you. It's interesting to me, at least of the 50 years I've been pastoring, that most everyone has some besetting sin that they deal with. One that has, hindered them for some time, that tends to be repeated, that tends to get in the way. If you stick with the running analogy, maybe, it's that ankle that always seems to ache, or that hamstring injury that keeps coming back, or maybe it's, that bad form. There's a temptation for you, a difficulty that is plaguing you and keeping you from giving to the Lord everything that you should. Maybe you're tempted by lust. Maybe you're an angry person. Maybe you tend to selfishness or jealousy. Maybe you're not always so honest. You always like to shade the truth a little bit. Maybe you're just lazy. Whatever it is a sin which easily besets you, easily entangles you. What sin this morning keeps you from responding to God's love? Holds you back? Are you covetous? Are you critical? Are you prideful? Just unthankful? Whatever it is, it's besetting. It's an easy snare. It is a problem, you have to deal with. It may not be somebody else's, but it's yours. Paul says this, divest, get rid of hindrances and the sin which easily besets you. Do it consciously and systematically and run to win. Divest, first word. Second word, run. Lay aside the sin which so easily ensnares you, verse 1, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Look, once you've lightened the load, the only thing left to do is run. Now I'll let you in on a secret that you already know. All of us have been given by the Lord a specific course to run. It's unique to you. It's God's plan and God's purpose for your life. Some paths on the outside watching seem to be flat and straight. Other paths of life seem to be crooked and uphill all the time. All of them are long. Some of them are longer. But without exception, the glory is to finish. You want to finish the race, don't you? You want to finish what God has begun. I may not be able to run your race. Sometimes I stand in awe of the way that people have been able to walk with the Lord. You may not be able to run my race, but God enables each of us to run a course that he's laid out before us. And if we finish well, there's glory waiting. Well done, good, faithful servant. So run with endurance. You know, life is not a 100-yard dash. The race is not for sprinters, but for plodders. It's not for the fast or the slow, for the weak or for the strong. It's just that perseverance that just moves you along day in and day out. Maybe this morning you woke up and said, man, I'm not going today, I'm sleepy. But here you are. The word running here is the Greek word for agony, where we get our word agony. In other words, your walk with Jesus isn't some leisurely walk. It is some agonizing pursuit that will demand your full attention and commitment. Back in the early 80s, there was a fellow named Bill Broadhurst. He joined a group of others to run the Pepsi 10K challenge in Omaha, Nebraska. What was unique to him is 10 years earlier, he had suffered a brain aneurysm that had left him all but paralyzed on his left side. He was a champion runner. He looked like he would probably go to the Olympics. Obviously, this changed the course of his life. That morning, 1,200 men and women showed up. It was early July, and the gun went off, and the surge of people raced forward, 10K race. Everyone but Bill. Bill was there. He threw his stiff left leg forward. He pivoted on it. His foot kind of dully hit the ground, and he would do it over and over and over again. There were plenty of folks that day who finished in well under 30 minutes. Bill finished in 2 hours, 26 minutes. Only a small crowd was still left at the finish line when he finished. They cheered his arrival, but there was a fellow there at the time named Bill Rogers. Bill Rogers was a famous marathon runner. He had won that day as well. He had a new gold medal hung around his neck, and he waited for Bill to get to the finish line. They had been friends, and he said to him as he stepped up, "Your finish is the most glorious one that I've ever been involved with. You may have finished last, but you finished first in perseverance and endurance." And he put his gold medal around his buddy's neck. That's the way the Lord will have us run. You don't have to be hasty as a Christian, but at the same time, you don't want to just sit back. You don't have to be in a hurry, yet you should do everything without delay. Determined, though exhausted, we want to finish. And don't let anything hold you, keep you, remove you from the process of going forward. You got to run the race. This is your generation. This is your time to run. Go back to chapter 11. You can read about all the folks who've run already. And they're sitting down, finished. Not you. You still got to divest, and now you got to run. It says that we should run agony with endurance. The word endurance, fairly common Greek word in the Bible, hupomone. It literally means to do it without let up or to do it without quit. It does seem to me some Christians get out of the gates like they're running, one lap. 2 weeks into their relationship with God, they've got 10 bumper stickers on their car and 5 witness shirts and a Bible big enough to choke a mule, and and then 3 months later you go, where are they? What happened to them? Out of the gate, much progress, and then they realize how long the road is. Marathons are long. Stupid long. And they look down the road and they think, man. But now they've heard the songs, they've heard the jokes, they've been in fellowship, they've been to the men's conference. 45 more years. What? I don't know if I can do that. And so they begin to halt and they sit down on the sidelines and they get weary and the obstacles get in their way and they don't endure very well. Run with endurance. Agonize without quit. To me, nothing makes less sense than running without a desire to win. We have at our church lots of intramural sports teams who play in city leagues, and we use it as an opportunity to witness. We make sometimes dinner, before a game and invite the guys over, pray with them and all. And I played for years. I'm not playing anymore because that's stupid. No, I'm old, man. I'm slow. But every year for the years I played, my wife would come along unless it was a 9 o'clock game. And then you get home like 10:45. It was late. She wouldn't go. But if I went to a 9 o'clock game, she was always up when I came home. And she'd always say this, "Did you win?" And sometimes I had to go, "No, we lost." And then she'd say, "Well, at least did you have fun?" And I thought, that's the dumbest question I ever. I told you we lost. What more do you need to know than that? It's a race that we want to win, isn't it, gentlemen? This is a tough generation to be running in, but this is the one God's given you. Endurance demands sacrifice if you're going to get the prize. So we divest, that's one. We run is two. Thirdly, we focus. Verse 2, looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He despised the shame. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Stripped of all weights and hindrances and sin, running with perseverance for the long run, we are now told what to do. As we set forth to present our bodies a living sacrifice, we should focus upon Jesus. The word focus here is only used here in the Bible. The word apharao means to fill your vision, your field of vision with only one thing. It literally means to turn a dial on a pair of binoculars until only one thing appears. And that's the word Paul uses. Now that you're in the race, make sure that all you see is Jesus. Keep your eyes upon Jesus. Nothing can hinder more a runner than with your eyes are in the wrong place. If you look down at your shoes or look up at the sky or look over your shoulder, you know how that works. I'll tell you a personal story. I spent a lot of years surfing at Huntington Beach. But when I got older and I surfed less, but I need to get in shape more, we'd go running along the beach path. And my wife would bring her bike, and then she would cheer me on and hand me water bottles or sometimes just laugh at me. But it was a good relationship either way. One Saturday morning, I was running along that bike path when the waves were particularly good. And I remember clearly running in that direction and looking at the water. What I failed to see was there was a woman on the path walking a little chihuahua-like dog. And I ran into her. I didn't just bump her, nailed her. She went flying back, landed on her backside. All of the people around being Saturday, you heard this collective, oh. My wife looked and just rode away. She wasn't going to make any part of that whatsoever. But look, we can't live this Christian life looking around. We're going to have to keep our eyes upon the Lord. If this morning you are looking at other Christians, you're liable to be stripped up or tripped up. I can't begin to tell you how many people I've seen in church over the years that their spiritual lives suffer because of what somebody else said or did. They weren't faithful, they weren't kind, we thought we could count on them. I looked up to them, they let me down. The problem is you're looking in the wrong place. If we're going to run this race, I got to keep my eyes on Jesus. Not on the Christians in the church, not on the world around me, not on the difficulty of the course. I got to look at the Lord. If I don't look at the Lord, I'll get tripped up by your sin or my own, by the temptations in the world, by the hard road that I have to follow, by the unfairness of the circuit. I got to focus on Jesus. Let me give you one example you can look it up on YouTube, even though it's an old example. In it was in August of 1954. They held every year in Vancouver what was known as the British Empire Commonwealth Games. The reason the 1954 race was so important, it had in it two men, the only two men ever up to that point, that had run a sub 4-minute mile. The Miracle Mile, they called it. It would pit a fellow named Roger Bannister. He was the first fellow to ever break the 4-minute mile, against an Australian guy named John Landy, who at the time was the record holder. So both of them were in peak condition. They would run again years later, but by then they looked like the rest of us. Running was not really what they were going to be doing. When they interviewed Bannister before the race, and like I said, you can look it up on YouTube, he said to the interviewer, my strategy is to ease up on the third lap of the 4 laps and then to give it my all on the 4th. However, Landy, his opponent, poured it on the 3rd lap, and on the backstretch, he got a huge lead. And Bannister realized, I can't let this guy get this far away. So he had to give it his all on the 3rd lap and adapt. And by the time they passed the start-finish line for the bow lap, Landy was ahead, but Bannister stayed with him. But he said to the reporters afterwards, man, I was just dead. In the final stretch of the race, with 90 meters to go, Landy said later he could no longer hear Bannister's footsteps in line with his. And so he made this fatal mistake. He stopped and he looked over his shoulder. The minute he turned and looked, Bannister said, thank you very much. Distracted with his concentration, he gave his last ditch effort and he beat Landy by 5 yards at the tape. 3:58.6, 3:59.8. 0.8 of a second. Why? Because he looked back. It was the only time and the only race at the time when both men finished a race in under 4 minutes. I know that's we're quite a ways ahead of that now, but that was as dramatic as it comes. It was a highlight of the track world. Like I said, they'd only faced each other's one more time, and they were well out of shape by then. So what does Paul tell these Hebrew saints? Come on, get rid of the weights, run to win with endurance, and while you're running, just keep Jesus in focus. He is the author and the finisher of your faith. By the way, extra credit here. In that same afternoon race, there was a guy named Jim Peters who was the world record holder of the marathon. And the way they ran it, they ran 17 miles through the streets, and then they finished in the stadium for whatever many laps that was. Needless to say, he got to the stadium 20 minutes before anybody else. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then, as he was running in the stadium, he collapsed. And everyone ran by him. He couldn't finish. Not exactly smart running. A bronze statue of the two men that I just explained to you is, for years, stood outside the Empire Stadium. It's been moved to the Pacific National Exhibition Hall, all of them in Vancouver. But both of the guys showed up for the dedication of this bronze statue. And when they interviewed Landy that day, he said, you know, Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. And I looked back and was turned into a statue of bronze. It is easy for believers who know better to look away from Jesus, be distracted by the enemy, stormy waters, family and friends. For the Hebrews here, Nero was certainly a terror, and they got their eyes off of Jesus. If you fill your focus just upon him, I think you'll be fine. I can tell you with certainty that he's never let me down once. But everyone else I know has. Not that they meant to, but life is not quite that way. He's the only one I need, as Paul said to the Colossians. He's in all, right? He's all I need. I got to keep my eyes on the Lord. And then whatever anyone else does or says or however the world's going, it really won't move me. I'll still be running to win and seeking to reach my generation. By using the name Jesus here instead of Christ, Paul would get our attention to focus on his earthly ministry. He had run the perfect race. He was the archegos. He was the author, the pioneer of our faith. You want to know how to run? Keep your eyes on Jesus. Don't follow afar off. Don't get too far ahead. Stay behind him on his shoulder. There he goes. Here's where I'm going. Follow him. As you present your body a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, it's your reasonable service. He wants to use your life now. I'd like to say you owe him, but you should know that. And Jesus isn't just our archegos, he's the teleos, he's the perfecter of our faith as well. His entire earthly life was the embodiment of trusting the Father and living by faith, dependent fully upon him. He was simply following his Father's will. It enabled him to survive the crucifixion, the mocking, the rejection, and the desertions. So, keep your eyes on Jesus and deliberately look away for whatever hinders you and distracts you, because for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. It's interesting. I talked to somebody recently this verse came up, and they said, well, sure, it was easier for Jesus. He was God. I said, well, I don't think you get the scriptures very well. He emptied himself of that privilege, right? Though he was equal with God, he emptied himself. He was fully human. He didn't depend upon or use that prerogative. So I think it was harder for Jesus in every way, because he could not relieve the pressure like we do by blowing our stock, sinning for a minute. Oh, sorry, Lord. Feel better now, though. The physical pain he endured, absolute. The spiritual suffering of being separated from his Father, which is what sin does, beyond comprehension. Yet for the joy set before him, what was the joy? Well, Father, I do always those things which please you. John 17, Father, that they might be one as we are, that they might be where I am. You're the joy set before him. The Lord went through it for you. That ought to get you to motivate yourself to present your body. He did this for you. You know anybody else who did this for you? I don't think so. But he did it for you. Though he despised the shame. The word despise means to count as nothing. It didn't matter what he had to pay, because nothing could hinder the accomplishments that was coming. And I would say the same thing to you and I. We can despise the shame of having to walk through this world shouting his name and the difficulty that it might bring us, but I could hardly care. He is the one that I want to please. And certainly he's the one that I want to serve. For the joy set before him, he sat down then at the right hand of the Father. As far as witnesses go, we have plenty to look at in Hebrews 11, but none of them comes close to the one I follow, Jesus Christ. Divest, run, focus, final word, verse 3, consider. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you would become weary and discouraged in your souls, for you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. Consider, it's a word in Greek that means take it all in, take full notice. For doing so will keep you from becoming discouraged or giving up in this running. What was Jesus motivated by? Pleasing the Father and your salvation, your fellowship, the glory of the Father, and your salvation. So he endured. So you endure. Why? To please the Father. And to be sure that the world hears from you that Jesus is Lord. Because that's why we're here, isn't it? That they might be saved. Paul said, just consider Jesus' suffering so that you don't get weary and discouraged. Don't get discouraged. We'll stick with the sports lingo. You'll hit the wall. You'll go bonkers. You'll collapse in exhaustion. You'll just give up before you get to the finish line. If you want to avoid a spiritual collapse, somebody said, what did I hear someone say the other day? Oh, they're just weary. And I'm thinking, how in the world can you be weary of serving the Lord that you love? I always love making my wife happy. I never get tired of that. And I guarantee you she doesn't get tired of it. If you want to avoid a spiritual collapse, consider what Jesus went through. And the word consider here is the Greek word analogosomai, but literally that's where we get our word logarithm from. It literally means factor in, or if you will, calculate what Jesus has gone through, and then look at your own life. Or if you will, hey, you ain't going through anything compared to what he's gone through. Consider him, then consider you. He was meek and steadfast and dependent upon the Father. He stood before Pilate and Herod and the Sanhedrin and others. You're never going to be asked to face the things that he suffered. So don't gripe or complain. Let's go, man. We got work to do. So Paul says to the Hebrews and then to the Romans, look up in the stands. Who's sitting there? Patriarchs like Abraham and prophets like Moses and Daniel, apostles, Peter and James, John, martyrs like James and Stephen and Polycarp and Jim Elliot, and preachers like Spurgeon and Calvin and Wesley and other saints who have, whose faces are adorning the walls and sitting in the stands. But now it's your turn to run. We have a reputation to uphold. We have a Lord to serve. We have history, and we have responsibility. But know this, none of that falls upon your shoulders until God convinces you of what he's done for you. It's the old therefore. It's the therefore of Romans 11. It's the therefore of Hebrews 12. It's the therefore of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. There's a bunch of therefore, and it's all the same. God has done this. What will you do as a result? Well, I'll be happy to divest my life of the hindrances and the sin and lighten the load of those things that not only offend me, but offend the Lord. If your right hand offend you, was that Matthew 5? Cut it off. Pretty brutal verse, but it literally just says, whatever it costs, it's worth it. Divest yourself. Run with patient endurance, whatever course God has marked out for you, one foot in front of the other. It's going to be a long race. You're going to be at it a while. But focus on Jesus. He's the one who will lay out for you as you read his word how you can live by faith, and by his example, with joy, you can serve the Lord and finish the course. And if you're ever discouraged, just set yourself next to Jesus for a while and say, man, he went through it far more than he's ever asked me to go through it. You haven't yet sweat great drops of blood striving against sin. Jesus did. The pressure that his body was under for the sacrifice he would need to make in separation from the Father, which is why in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from my groanings? It only was a little while. It was about the 6th hour, near 3 o'clock, when the Lord cried that from the cross. But that was the scariest part. That was the most brutal part. Sin separates you. I hope you would be that much fearful as well, that you would ever find yourself in that condition, separated from God. Jesus made sure that never had to happen to you. He's worth running for, isn't he? You going to do that for us? Come on, church. Let's go get somebody.